Hello and welcome back to my channel and to my BBC TV Shakespeare retrospective. And this time we're discussing two plays where women come back from the dead. That's right, we're talking about All's Well That Ends Well and The Winter's Tale. Now, both of these plays are rather odd. All's Well That Ends Well is particularly odd. You've heard me talk about this idea of problem plays. That's what they call, there are three plays, this play, Measure for Measure and Troilus and Cressida, which academics have called problem plays because the sympathies of the audience are complicated. We don't really know what to feel and who to empathise with. Now, in the case of something like Measure for Measure, it's because of the actions of the king, the actions of power and law and order. But to tell you the truth, the only thing that's really problematic about All's Well That Ends Well is the behaviour of the central male character, Bertram, because he is, without doubt, the biggest twat in Shakespearean history. It's just impossible to like. He's this really sort of wooden, pompous young man who the heroine, Helena, called Helen throughout this production for some strange reason, is inexplicably in love with. We don't really see why. And he treats her abominably. I tend to subscribe to the theory that the only way we can forgive Bertram is because he's a representation of the callowness of youth. One of Shakespeare's ongoing themes is an interest in the different generations and how they work. Now, to be fair, her actions are also rather odd. Instead of sort of courting him, she's a lower class than him, so she kind of tries to trick him into marrying her by performing this miracle cure on the king. There's a very fairy tale aspect to this play, so that her father was a doctor and he's passed on this miracle cure that no one else in the kingdom knows about. And she cures him. And because she cures him, she can choose her husband and she chooses him. And he says, no, I don't like that. I don't like it. Which is kind of reasonable, really. And then he rejects her rather horribly in front of everybody. So then she devises another scheme to get him into her bed. So the girl that he actually likes, Diana, she cons her, saying, I'll take your place in bed at night, I'll disguise myself, to consummate the marriage and therefore trick him into marriage again. And director Elijah Mazinski seems intent on stressing this idea of Helena as a master manipulator. When she's tending to the king, there's a scene where she moves in for a rather sultry kiss. Is she seducing the king knowingly, and is the king part of that? So Helena is no innocent victim. She seems to be a puppet master more than anyone else. So that's the problem of the play, is that the two young leads, the love interests, behave in a rather strange manner. But there's no real discussion of power or the abuse of power as there is in Measure for Measure. So I don't really see it as a problem play. I just see it as a rather warped fairy tale, really. Now, the interesting thing about All's Well That Ends Well is the mode of All's Well That Ends Well is primarily comedy. It's shot through with typical Shakespearean darkness, but it's played for comic effect most of the time. What's interesting about this production, directed by Elijah Mazinski, is it dampens down the comedy almost to the point of being very serious drama. In production terms, it's a very dark production. And you know how in previous episodes of this series they've tried to make it look Vermeerian? Well, this looks like Rembrandt, particularly Celia Johnson with her big ruff and her ageing face. And there's also a beautiful shot very early on where the camera sort of creeps up on Helena as she's playing on a harpsichord and beautifully lit just like a Rembrandt painting. So literally it's a dark production, but also metaphorically and figuratively it's a dark production. The comedy performances are very subtle and dampened down. And this is seen most powerfully in the subplot regarding Parolles. Now, Parolles is kind of like the fool in this. He's a sort of boastful coward, right? Brilliantly played by Peter Jeffrey, who's one of my favourite character actors. He usually plays villains or suave gentlemen. But here he's playing the fool. But his performance is so tampered down that he's almost a sort of serious dramatic character. And what happens is that Bertram and his fellow soldiers trick him. They lull him into a situation where he thinks he's being tortured and interrogated. Again, the actions of the characters are rather odd. And they force him to denounce, Bertram himself. And so he's completely humiliated and dishonoured. But the What is brilliant about this production is that once the men have gone away, Bertram is left alone and has this wonderful soliloquy where he says, yes, okay, I've lost everything, but I'm still alive. And he abases himself, he becomes a beggar, and he's redeemed. And there is Shakespeare's humanity shining through. It's the most brilliant scene in the play, I think, especially in this production. It's a scene that reminds me a lot of the persecution of Malvolio in Twelfth Night, where the foolish character is pushed a bit too far for the parameters of comedy, and we start to move into tragedy and something much darker and nastier. It's not a very popular play, All's Well That Ends Well. It's not performed very often. I've only ever seen it once before this production. I saw it in London with Judi Dench playing the mother. This production, I think, is absolutely outstanding. I don't think the play could have been done better. What's interesting about this production is it's the first time that a director is allowed to bring their own personal take on the material. So Młynarski is allowed, he was an Australian opera director, I believe, but he was allowed to bring this very dark, very serious approach to what is normally a comic play. And it really works. And it binds the production together. It gives it a wholeness. It gives it a consistency, which is lacking in some of the earlier productions. You know, you could argue that up to this point we've had traditional readings of the plays, and I've quite liked that traditional reading. But I'm happy that Młynarski was given his head here, because this is a very tricky play to like. And this very particular approach, this consistent approach, binds it together and makes it a really interesting production. And I think this is probably one of, if not the best production so far in the series. It's helped, of course, by its amazing cast. I can't get over this playwright. So you've got people like Michael Hordern, Robert Lindsay, Kevin Stoney and Valentine Dyall playing bit parts, supporting roles. Absolutely incredible. The central role is played by Angela Down, an actress I wasn't familiar with, but she is excellent. She really, develops the part of Helena. A very difficult part for a young actress, and I think she does a good job. Ian Charleson is his usual stolid self as Bertram, which is perhaps appropriate, just before he takes on Chariots of Fire, of course. I've mentioned Peter Jeffrey. I've mentioned Celia Johnson, who is outstanding. One of the revelations of watching this series has been to rediscover Celia Johnson as an elder actress. She's just incredible. And then, of course, there's cuddly old, lovely old Donald Sinden. He's there. Unfortunately, early on, we have to see him sitting up in bed with a naked chest, which I didn't really want to see Donald Sinden's naked chest, if I'm really honest about it. Donald Sinden revels in this part. You know the bit when he's well and the king dances out with Helena into the court? I mean, he really goes for it. It's a bit cringe-inducing. Very odd moment in the play, that, isn't it? But, we all laugh at Donald Sinden. He's the ultimate lovey, isn't he? I have some friends of mine, I hope they don't mind me saying this, who knew Donald Sinden, and they said that actually he knew what he was doing and he cared. So perhaps I'm being a bit harsh on Donald Sinden. I also want to mention Pippa Gard. She's in the role of Diana, a rather thankless role. And actually she's very, very good. We last saw her as Miranda in The Tempest, you'll remember. And she almost matches Angela Down. It's an easy role to throw away that, but she comes forward. She's got a lot of personal charisma, and I think she does well in that role. So overall, difficult play, not one of my favourites, but as a production, 5 stars. Probably the best production so far. Now let's move on to The Winter's Tale. Now this is a much more popular play and is often restaged. And it's a gift to directors, isn't it? I mean, you've got Exit pursued by a bear, and there is a bear, full-on bear, huge thing it is in this production. You've got the dancing, the sheep shearing, peasants' celebration. There's all sorts of things. You've got a statue coming to life. Directors love this production, and they can often mess it up. They always go a bit wild and a bit over the top and a bit abstract. The problem with this production is it's the other way around. It's too static. They've decided to do it on one set that they keep redecorating to evoke different landscapes. But it makes the play very still. I've seen this play performed on stage. I saw the Simon Russell Beale, where Simon Russell Beale played Leontes in London. And that moment, you've got that stillness, that rigidity of the first couple of acts, with Hermione on trial. And then it opens out and you get that burst of energy and dynamism from the peasants celebrating, the harvest and everything. And on stage it was fantastic. It was really enjoyable and light and bouncy. In this production, the sheep shearing celebration, which is the central part of the play, it's the musical bit, the fun bit, is so boring. It's so stodgy because it doesn't move. The camera's trapped behind people trying to see what's going on. They can't move out of this one space. It's just so dull. There's a sort of slowness in this production. I think the problem with The Winter's Tale is, I like the play, but dramatically there are issues here. You see, what Shakespeare does is, for the play to work about the seasons, he front loads the play with misery. My God, the first two acts are miserable, aren't they? I mean, there's just no hope in them at all, right? And then you get all the light stuff, and then it gets dark again when Polixenes also turns out to be a bit of a git, just like Leontes was. And then it gets darker, and then you get that sort of nice, beautiful ending, the Pygmalion ending, where she comes to life, right? The problem with this very static production is it shows up that rather laborious, clunky, dramatic scheme. The play doesn't flow. 1 minute you're sort of stuck in this kind of rigidity, and then you're stuck again in another kind of rigidity. You don't open out. You don't feel spring and summer. And I found that really annoying. I have to be honest, I struggled to get through this production. I found it very boring. We've gone from one of the best productions in the series to actually one of the worst. It's not very well directed by Jane Howell, and I think her production designer, he tried to come up with something that gave lines of sight, but actually there's just not enough movement, pulling us into the world of the characters. The cast is largely made up of people who I wasn't that familiar with. Jeremy Kemp is very good as Leontes. He speaks the verse beautifully. He's very good in the first part of the play as the jealous husband. Unfortunately, I think, there's that awkward moment when you have the trial of Hermione, then the oracles come in and say what Apollo has said, and suddenly Leontes has a change of heart straight away. It's quite a difficult moment to get across. And the problem is that I don't think Jeremy Kemp evokes that terrible, wrenching sense of guilt that Leontes has for the rest of the play. It doesn't really come across. He's a bit too stolid for my taste. Anna Calder Marshall is excellent as Hermione, very, very good, very noble. Then we have Robert Stephens as Polixenes. A rather odd, nothingy role for someone of the stature of Robert Stephens, because at that time he was regarded as one of the great Shakespeareans, one of the great British actors. I have to make a confession to you guys. I've never really liked Robert Stephens. I've never really bought into his reputation. He's too campy. Too florid for me. When he speaks the verse, it's like he's at a wine tasting, he's tasting it on his lips. He's always playing against the role. At the end, when Hermione is revealed, a very strange scene, she's been stuck in some room for 16 years without anyone knowing, and then she comes back. But anyway, it's usually a very moving scene, that when he says she's warm, I mean, that's always a moment in other productions that sort of breaks my heart, But in this production, in the background is Robert Stephens, and he's just looking at Leontes like that. He's not shocked in awe that this woman has come back to life, or that this statue walks. He's just waiting for Leontes' reaction like that. What are you doing? You do get the feeling with Robert Stephens that he has been down the coach and horses at lunchtime with some of the crew. You know what I mean? I'm sorry, it doesn't do it for me. Now, one person who does do it for me is good old Margaret Tyzack, who plays Paulina, I think a definitive Paulina. No one could give as much blood and thunder to that role as Margaret Tyzack, fresh from playing, Claudius's mother in I, Claudius, of course. She's great. There is one bad note in this cast, and we have to mention it. And I don't like singling out a young actress starting out, but she really isn't very good. In the crucial role of Perdita, Debbie Farrington, she is very wooden. And unfortunately, her scenes really drag, because she's just sort of speaking the verse like she's in a school play, And that wonderful scene that opens up the sheep shearer celebration, sheep shearer celebration, where she hands round the flowers to everybody, which is a lovely piece. It's one of the great set pieces of the scene. Is completely ruined by Farrington's rather wooden delivery, unfortunately. Elsewhere, Ricky Fulton is good as Autolycus, though again, those scenes drag terribly. You know, he's the fool, he's the rogue, and he plays that part well, but those scenes need a bit more punch. They need a bit more dynamism, they need a bit more movement. David Burke is a reliable self as Camillo. I also want to mention two elder gentlemen. There is Cyril Luckham as Antigonus, who has a wonderful voice, gorgeous voice. He's the one pursued by a bear. And I also want to mention lovely old Arthur Hewlett, who was always reliable as the old man, the trusty old fisherman or shepherd or whatever, and he's very good here as the father of Perdita. So overall, I didn't really enjoy this production very much. It was slow going. You know, the odd good bit of acting here and there, but I think that this production showed up the limitations of the play rather than flattering what's beautiful about it. See you next time for Timon of Athens and Antony and Cleopatra.